for now at least, the Ukrainians are fighting back hard.
Yes, I'm not sure they're fighting back hard, but they're at least doing something in facing a terribly difficult decision, because if they do nothing, they are seeing the dismemberment of their country under their noses. If they do respond, then Russia immediately claims that it's they, the Ukrainians, who are escalating. The chances of a diplomatic solution recede, and there's also the danger of bloodshed, and it is, of course, their own citizens who are on the other side of their barricades. So I think that seizing the airport probably is quite a sensible thing to do, because this is something a place that Russia could have used to bring in reinforcements. But I think that we're going to see an extremely difficult and dangerous few days and probably weeks ahead as this unrolls.
Charles Crawford?
Well, I agree with that. There's the diplomatic issue you have of talks coming up, but there are also the actual negotiations on the ground, and I think it's fair to say that there is a tension between the immediate need to try and keep things calm. But the wider problem we face actually in Europe is that the Russians, in a sense, are trying to, I think, rewrite the rules of the whole post-Cold War settlement. And this is something which is of such sort of massive implications, it's quite difficult to know where to start in dealing with it. But while we're thinking about that, individual municipal offices and individual airports and individual this and that are being taken over by people who are in one way or the other loyal to or under the orders of Moscow, and the situation is eroding as we speak. So I think this has to be looked at on different levels. The actions we're just seeing are part of what Edward has just said, I think rightly, is an attempt to try and claw some ground back by the Ukrainians. But it is a very dangerous situation.
I suppose, Edward Lucas, it's a tricky time, isn't it, particularly for the Ukrainians, given that they've just basically got rid of certain sections of their security forces.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the riot police, who in normal conditions they would be deploying to deal with that sort of thing, are in fact the same riot police who were deployed against the protesters in the streets of Kiev only a few weeks ago, when the government was the pro-Russian government of Mr. Yanukovych. So they've had to disband and downgrade this very unit that they most now need, and they're now using the infantry, which is not trained or equipped to do this sort of thing, so that's going to be very difficult. And I do also very much agree with Charles Crawford that this is just, if you like, one battle in a much wider war, which is a great test of the West's will. Putin thinks that we are fundamentally not prepared to impose economic sanctions on him, let alone use force against him, and he's making hay. He sees this as I think, as a defining moment in his attempt to rewrite the whole rules of the post-1991 security order in Europe, which he thinks is terribly unfair, not to Russia's advantage, and he's ploughing right ahead, and we're finding it terribly difficult to get a response.
From taking it a little bit further on that, Charles Crawford, if you would please, President Putin looking at bringing back a Russian empire?
Well, Russia is an empire. I think this is one of the things to understand, is that we've seen the end of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. Russia itself is an empire that spreads over 11 time zones, and there are plenty of bits of Russia which have been conquered down the centuries, which, if they were given the same sort of rights that Russia is demanding for eastern Ukraine, might themselves want to become independent. So I think there is a sense of frustration, certainly among Mr. Putin and people around him, who see the end of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe, as he put it, of the 20th century. Some of us might think the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was setting up the Soviet Union, leading to millions and millions and millions of Russians themselves being murdered by their own government. So I think there's a very big philosophical question at stake here, and I think part of the trouble we have in Western Europe, where we're used to really working things out by consensus and boring meetings and talking interminably in a way which frankly makes the public pretty frustrated at times, is dealing with a situation where those rules seem to be being leapfrogged by Russia for really almost explicitly imperial reasons. And this is a category of behaviour which we've just got used to not seeing.
When we were chatting to you ahead of the programme, Edward Lucas, your view was that you didn't see any immediate attempts to storm police stations and the like. Given what's happened over the last few moments, we're going to have to reevaluate.
Yes, I think they're trying to push back on the most lightly defended and perhaps the most strategically important places in this contested region of eastern Ukraine. I do think the airfield is one thing. I wouldn't be surprised to see them doing things to secure railway junctions as well, because their big nightmare will be that Russia responds to this by sending in so-called peacekeepers, and that this would then escalate things further. So they've got to try and secure the border and secure the transport links. I would be surprised if they try and launch an all-out assault on the sort of thing you've been showing on your television screens, where you've got local people, some of them, I think, quite sincere and perhaps been whipped up by Russian propaganda to believe that Kiev is run by fascists and that their rights are in danger. But I think it would be wise for them to try and de-escalate that by cutting off power and electricity to these buildings that have been seized, and really use the same tactics against the Russians that the Russians used against them in Crimea. If you remember, there were Ukrainian bases in Crimea, and the Russians didn't storm them. They just surrounded them, cut off the power and water and other sort of supplies, and waited until, in the end, they gave up and went home. And I think that would be the advice that the Ukrainians will be getting from their Western friends, is not to go for all-out assaults on anything that has civilians, but to try and concentrate on the things that are of military importance. And I guess that airfield is one of them.
OK, and Charles Crawford, presumably the Ukrainians still need to push ahead with plans for elections.
Well, I was just thinking that as Edward was speaking. Ukraine is in a difficult position. It wasn't a place clamouring for independence when the Soviet Union broke up. Many top Ukrainians stayed on in Russia and became Russian citizens. So it hasn't really performed very well over the last 20 or so years since independence. So it's not in itself a very powerful, strong state. And the divisions we're seeing are clearly very deep. And the normal way out of that, the European way out of it, would be through dialogue, through having new elections, through patiently building economic policies and having reform measures, and the IMF and the EU and Russia as well doing all this together. So it's very important that the Ukrainians get back on track in terms of legitimacy. And one thing I think Moscow really doesn't want is a strong government in Kiev, which is re-legitimized in the eyes of global opinion, because that will make it far harder for them to say, well, these are fascists and these are people who are oppressing Russian citizens and these are people who need to be opposed. So Russia has got a clear interest in making sure these elections do not pass off smoothly. And one thing we can be doing in the West, and not just the West, the whole of the international community who supports the proposition that there shouldn't be invasions and force, we should do everything we can to help these elections pass off peacefully and fairly in as much of the territory of Ukraine as we can organise. And that'll be a major step forward, I think, in terms of stabilising the situation according to decent standards.